Minister Murphy has 10 minutes.
Well, excuse me. I'd like to thank the Deputy for tabling this motion or using this PMB to table a bill. And I welcome the opportunity to speak on housing, the opportunity that we have every week in this stall, because we must, because this is a crisis, it is an emergency, as the Taoiseach has recognised. And I very much welcome the spirit of the bill, because the bill has been tabled before us in an attempt to help people who are really suffering. And we all know as deputies in this House how people are suffering with rents they can't afford, with insecurity of accommodation, a fear of homelessness, actually in emergency accommodation in far too many cases. The scale of the crisis is incredible when you look at it, absolutely, Deputy. And I recognise that that spirit, then the intention is to try and help. And in the context of the rental market, and again we had the DAFT report this week, and we have the RTB report, which is from a larger data set, but they tell us the same story about a trend, particularly in the rental sector, and the rents that are too high for people, unacceptably high, and how it's putting people to the pin of their collars. Unfortunately, the government will be opposing this bill, Deputy. There are a number of complications in the drafting of the bill, technical complications that we couldn't support, that couldn't be fixed at committee stage. That said, as well, there are a number of constitutional difficulties with the bill, as is presented to us. But even if we could overcome those two hurdles, there are ideas, concrete ideas before in this bill, though, that I believe would do more harm than good. There are unintended consequences that haven't been properly thought through. And of course, people will come with an idea to deal with a particular problem or particular aspect of our housing crisis. And it might do some good there in that moment. But the unintended consequences which they haven't thought of or haven't considered that would ripple through and potentially cause more harm than good, I think we have to be aware of. The Taoiseach has said that this is an emergency, and the bill talks about declaring an emergency. And I think one thing we have to ask ourselves is, does the absence of a formal declaration of an emergency prevent us from putting in place emergency responses? No, it does not, because we have put in place emergency responses. One example is the change in planning law. And you know how important planning law is in this country. All of the deputies in this House are in constituencies, I'm sure, where they have put in objections to different types of developments. We know how important it is, the right of individuals to be able to make their observations known when planning applications are put in, and yet we have put in place an emergency response in relation to fast-track planning there. Another way we could look at the question around a formal declaration of an emergency is, would a declaration, a formal declaration, allow us to do something that we aren't already doing? And the answer, quite simply, to that is no, it could not, because I've already looked at this, and I've spoken with the AG on this, the Attorney General. And for example, in the area of procurement law, where we could, if we could go outside of procurement law, fast-track the delivery of housing, and supply here is the fundamental issue. We could fast-track that and get that done more quickly than we can currently do today. But EU law on this is solid, and it cannot be ignored, even in the declaration of an emergency. And that law is put in there to protect the public good, because there are sometimes, and can be, and we've seen in the past, the negative consequences that can come when people ignore procurement law or go around it. Another area would be in relation to constitutional protections. Would the declaration of an emergency allow us to ignore certain aspects of the Constitution? No, it would not. But that does not mean that we cannot, in terms of the existing Constitution and the existing interpretations, rebalance the rights away from the individual and towards the collective, because we recognise that there is an emergency. But we can't trample on those individual rights altogether. And to give examples briefly of where we've rebalanced those constitutional rights, the vacant site levy is one, where we have put a tax, a levy on people's property, their own property that they own, because we're not happy with the way that they are using it or not using it, as is the case. Another example of where we've rebalanced those rights is in relation to rent pressure zones, the rent caps, putting in place a restriction on what you can charge for something that you own, but also the rental reforms that have come, and more that are going to come, that will further limit the ways in which people use properties that they own. So we can find that rebalancing of rights within the current Constitution, but we can't trample on those rights at the same time. And as I said, the absence of a declaration of an emergency or a formal declaration has not prevented us from putting in place emergency responses. I already mentioned the fast-track planning process, which has seen thousands of new homes get approval for planning permission in the 3-month time frame that's been put in. The Help to Buy scheme to help first-time buyers, again, a temporary emergency response. Home Building Finance Ireland, again, will be a temporary response, recognising the scale of the emergency in one part of our housing sector where small builders up and down the country cannot still get the finance to build those small clusters of homes that we need built in many parts of the country. Family hubs, of course, are an emergency response, because we recognise that hotel accommodation is not suitable for families. And Housing First is a response to the emergency that we have, but it will be with us for many years, because the complexity of individual people in homelessness is one that does take years to solve. That said, Housing First More than 200 tenancies have been created through the Housing First programme, and between 80 to 90% of the people who've taken up those tenancies haven't fallen back into homelessness. So it does take people out of emergency and keep them out of emergency. The rent caps, another emergency response, a temporary response that we've put in place because there isn't currently enough supply in the rental market. And of course, with the housing assistance payment, the new form of social support to people in the private rental market has the discretion that's in there, 20% above, and has the homeless HAP discretion, the 50% above prices that we've put in place there as well, recognising the emergency that people are facing in trying to meet the bills, and also the fact that prices and rents are too high, and that means the government unfortunately has to pay more until more homes are built. We're regulating short-term lets, that'll be a longer-term measure, again recognising the fact that there isn't enough housing stock there at the moment. And the initial response that we took more than 2 years ago now, 6 billion of funding ring-fenced to deliver 50,000 homes into the stock of social housing, to see the economy producing at least 25,000 homes in that time period, but building to 110,000 social housing homes under Project Ireland 2040. All of these things that we are doing is recognising the emergency that we have, recognising the severe difficulties that people have been placed in, and doing everything we can as a government in Oireachtas to put in place supports that can protect those people in this time of crisis. You do in your bill, Deputy, talk about the emergency being in place for 3 years, and I would welcome that time horizon because I think it recognises that this could not be solved overnight, even if you put in place additional responses. The ones that you outline, which are quite radical and unfortunately unconstitutional, you talk about a 3-year review or a 3-year period, which would bring us to the end of 2021, which is the time horizon for rebuilding Ireland, which is a 5 or 6 year plan that we have put in place to bring about real reform for the rental sector, to introduce things like cost rental. I talked about the numbers of homes that need to be built, and also the thousands of people and families who will be prevented from entering into emergency accommodation because of the different programmes that have been put in place into Rebuilding Ireland, and the thousands more that will exit in that period of time as well. You talk about a review at the end of that 3-year period. We've actually already looked beyond 2021 in Project Ireland 2040 and committed to those 110,000 homes over that time period out to 2027. That's roughly about 12,000 homes a year into the stock of social housing after 2021. So a huge amount has already been planned for and prepared for to make sure that as we come out of this particular period of crisis that we have at the moment, that we'll make sure that we don't fall back into a crisis in the future. So that no matter what is happening in the wider economy, and there will be shocks in the future, of course there will be, we will never stop the state producing homes into the stock of social housing on local authority land. I think that's very important. In the time that I have left, I just want to go briefly through, if I may, some of the proposals that are in the bill. One seeks to protect or prohibit evictions, and we have to be careful here around our language because, of course, an eviction is a very different thing to a notice of termination. Evictions happen where someone is not paying the rent or there's been damage to the property, and it has been enforced through the court of law. And evictions aren't the main source of people entering into emergency accommodation, but we know that one of the sources is where a notice of termination has been served. And I know that, Deputy, in this you are trying to help people from finding themselves in that precarious position where they have to find a new place to live. And I know there's too many people are in that situation, but to actually put in place such a provision could actually dramatically decrease the supply of homes that we have to rent. And the rental sector is a part of the solution, and we need more homes in the rental sector, not less. That said, we can give greater protections to renters through rent transparency, which is coming in the forthcoming bill that I will publish very shortly. We can give independent enforcement powers to the RTB, so the renter doesn't have to worry about themselves. The RTB will do that for them. And we can give longer notice to quit periods, so that they have a greater period of time to find a new place to live when a notice of termination is served. And the government's new bill will do all of these things. The bill looks to freeze rents, and I think we have to think about unintended consequences here that could do more harm than good, as I said, because almost all economists agree that when you freeze rents in an economy, or even in a particular part of the economy, a geographic location, it actually undermines the supply of homes in that area. What we also get is people staying in their existing arrangements. So there's less movement in the market, and a rental market needs movements. Two people meet each other, they come together as a couple, they go from 2 homes into one, it frees up 1 home. Or 2 people in a relationship fall out of that relationship, and they need to move somewhere else and find a new place to live. Economists who've looked at rent freezes see that that churn doesn't happen, and that it actually prevents new people from entering into the market as they move to a country or come of working age or move to a different part of that country. All of these things have happened, they've been tried, and they have failed. And another thing that we see, which means that rent freezes aren't a social good, is that people who could afford to pay more don't have to. And so their rents, or their potential rent increase, is subsidised by people who are earning less. I don't think that's socially desirable. So it's another unintended consequence of rent freezes. But that said, we can and we have put rent caps in place. 4% per annum in rent pressure zones. They have worked, but they need to work better, and we need to do more to make them work better. And the bill that I'm introducing very shortly will do that. It will strengthen rent pressure zones, and it will make it a serious offence to be in breach of them, and it will give the RTB more powers and more resources to properly police them. The bill also looks to reduce rents, all rents, very dramatically, but 70 to 80% of our landlords own only 1 or 2 properties. Many of them are accidental landlords because of the crash that we saw in the economy. And they need a rent, a fair rent, to be able to cover the investment they've made, because perhaps maybe a mortgage on that second property. And that second property might actually be leveraged against their own home. So the unintended consequence of doing that would be, unfortunately, to undermine those own people's housing security. And so it could actually make our homeless crisis worse, but also reduce the number of properties that are available to rent in the rental sector. Just to conclude, if I may, very briefly, last Ceann Comhairle, because I'm out of time. I know that rents are too high, Deputy. I know that supply is still too low. I know that renters need greater protections, but we don't need to declare an emergency as a potentially tokenistic response, because we can actually put in place greater protections without doing that. And it isn't the case that declaring an emergency would allow us to do things that we can't already. So we will do those things to fix these problems. We will do everything that we can to help get people out of emergency accommodation more quickly than we already are, and to prevent people from having to enter into emergency accommodation. We will do more and we will do better. Thank you.